morning, listeners. I'm Christian.
And I'm Micah, and welcome to the Morning Ponderings podcast.
In this show, we aim to explore the possibilities allotted to us by our limited knowledge and understanding.
Our goal is to explore the possibilities of life's greatest mysteries so that empathy for others can flourish. How's your morning, Christian? How is your morning
Oh my goodness. Going? It is one of those mornings, man. You and I are both feeling it. Is there something about like the weather or the moon phase or something? Because it's a little bit of an off morning. Yeah. Man.
Tell me about
it. It's one of those mornings. So one of my morning pleasures. Yours is the bagel with butter on it. For me, I like to get some 3-minute oats from I can't remember the brand, Quaker brand.
Oh, no, yeah.
It's not that. Maybe it is. Anyways, I like to get the 3-minute oats, and then I put peanut butter and jelly in it.
Oh, no. That's
yes,
gross. I'm sorry.
Dude, I'm going to spare you some of the crazy food things, or maybe I should just fill you in on some of the crazy food things that I do. Let's just say mac and cheese can be pretty delicious if you just coat it in applesauce.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm really surprised you said that because funny enough, that used to be what my wife did.
Oh, no. Really?
Yeah, she used to do that. But the reason she did that is because she didn't like mac and cheese, and later found out she was allergic to milk, and so she did that to tolerate mac and cheese. Is like at school, like they would give her mac and cheese and applesauce and like chicken or something, and she would mix them together so she could eat them.
Wow, I'm not alone.
That's strange.
Yeah, I remember. I have this distinct memory. My mom claims that she's the one who told me about it, but I have this distinct memory of I was always trying to keep my food separate on the plate or whatever, and then the applesauce and mac and cheese got mixed up at one day, and I was like, you know what, whatever, and I just ate it, and I was like, this is amazing. This is even better than regular mac and cheese, and so now I do it every time. Anyways.
Oh no, that's
to get back to the other crazy food thing that I do. I do peanut butter and jelly oatmeal, and usually I have a little kettle, and I start the water boiling, and I pour that onto the oatmeal, and I let that kind of creates the texture that I like with the taste that I like. Forgot to turn the kettle on, so I just poured cold water onto my oatmeal, and then I had to microwave it and messed up the texture. So it's just been one of those mornings, man. How's your morning been, though?
It's been pretty good, I guess, so far. Besides, my earbuds not working and hoping that these earbuds don't bleed as much as they have been.
I'm not hearing a ton of echoing right now, I'll be honest. So
that's good. That's good. But hey, this week, or I guess this weekend, I decided to pull the trigger and getting some of the audio equipment that I've been wanting to get. And so I will have a nice new mic today. Unfortunately, not before this podcast, but it's coming in today, and I'm super, super excited. It's gonna definitely get me a jump start on my home studio that I've been waiting. I've got I don't have a good mic right now, so.
I'm actually really curious. So I remember seeing a TikTok a while back that you're looking to do some home recording. How is that pursuit coming along?
It's actually going really well. I'm spending a lot of time doing it, in my free time. And I recorded a lot in college because we had a free studio. And so I spent many hours in the studio just recording stuff. And so I kind of know how to record, and I love making music. I love writing music. And so I'm recording some songs that I've been writing recently. And I've got 3 that I've started and I'm working on right now that are, I don't know if I would say they're halfway through, but I've been just mostly recording the MIDI instruments that I can do with my little MIDI keyboard. And then I played the guitar into this mic, but it doesn't sound great. So it's just really a placeholder and until I get my new mic.
Gotcha.
But yeah.
So I imagine that with all of the changes that you're experiencing in life right now, that there's a lot to write about in that, or do you find that because you are moving away from a place in your life that you were so familiar with for so long, that there's a little bit of a what to do now kind of situation.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of both because it's a new world for me, but I'm so used to writing out of my personal experience and kind of taking my emotions and feelings and putting them into words and music. And
Mhm.
so there's definitely a lot to write about, and I'm still writing a lot. If anything is holding me back, it's just like time, like just the craziness of life. And I'm not used to working at night. And so like that's normally when I would be creative and do things, but now I'm like up all day and then work at night. Um, just weird. But
Mhm.
yeah, so I'm still writing a lot. I have a whole album written. I don't know if every song is gonna like be recorded, and I'll probably write more that will be eventually, but I'm hoping to release an album in the next year, hopefully. We'll
Hey,
see.
that'd be cool. Look forward to listening to it.
Yeah. Who knows? I might release it slowly. I might release it all at once. We'll see.
Uh, All right. Well, today we have the second part of a deep dive into theism slash atheism. But I mean, especially
Sure.
this time around, we're going to be focusing on theism. Would you like to kind of give our listeners an idea of like how last episode went, especially since you probably listened to it a few more times than I have being the editor?
Yeah. Yeah. So last episode, we really just tried to hone in and talk about the possibility of the existence of God and some of the main arguments around that, some of the things that would point to a God and some things that might point against a God. But we didn't really talk about the what this God could be like. And so
Hmm.
that's kind of what our goal for today is we're not as much going to be getting into arguments of does this specific God exist, or well, I guess kind of more the specific versions of God or gods. But
Yeah, before it was more broadly, can a deity exist? And this time it's more specifically, what possible characteristics would a deity have that might exist in like alongside our world and reality
right,
and
so
experience?
we're definitely going to be today talking under the assumption that something does exist. So because there's not really a point in in talking about the nature and identity of what this deity could be, there's not really a point in saying, well, it could just not exist because then he could just not exist. So, or
Hmm.
it could, who knows, um, could just not exist. So we're going to be operating under that assumption today, just for the sake of our conversation. And I think it's going to be a good one.
Yeah. And we usually have a call before this where we talk about the structure of things. We didn't really get a chance to do that this time around, so I'm curious how it's going to all unfold.
Yeah, we will see.
Hmm. All right, so one of the biggest conversations that we get into when we talk about the possible existence of a god, especially if they are an omnipotent, omnipotent,
Yeah.
omniscient, and omnipresent God.
Right.
One of the biggest things you run into is, okay, so if there is a God with all of those three attributes that exists in co- what's the word, in conjunction with our reality and all of the experiences of humans across the globe, what are the odds that that God is it even possible that that God is good?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of human experiences to consider when you're diving into that. What are your thoughts, like, to begin with, Micah?
I think that's often the claim of Christians, right? Is that it's that God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and they usually also make the claim that he's omnibenevolent.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of like you were saying, there's so much life experience to consider whenever it comes to could that God exist and could that God actually be good? Because if it does have all of those characteristics, we've got a problem. And that is
Mm-hmm.
when most people will bring up the problem of evil. Like, how do you explain one, that there's just evil in the world? Two, that there is so much suffering, especially for people who have not really done anything wrong, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
children suffer and like how do you explain all this unnecessary suffering if there's a good God who has the power, the knowledge, and the ability to stop that suffering and to step in and do something? Like, could that God actually be good if they watch all the suffering happen but don't do anything about it? So what do you think about all that?
Well, oftentimes when I try and solve this issue, I guess, or just think of the possible solutions to this issue, I mean, we're going to start with looking at the common Christian perception of a God with all these omni attributes. And we might consider what it might look like if God didn't have those omni attributes later. But for now, what I like to do is I like to look at the things in the world and the obvious truths that, well, sometimes they're not super obvious to somebody who's grown up in the lap of luxury, maybe even doesn't even realize they've grown up in the lap of luxury. But I like to look at situations that I know or am pretty certain are true, and then ask the question, okay, what does that say about God? Okay. And not to ask the question in a way that's like drawing conclusions about his motives or his intentions. But for example, I can be a fully devout Christian and I'm still going to grow old. My body is still going to deteriorate. I'm going to experience the pains of aging, and eventually the people I love and have most dear to me will die, if not of natural causes, then by any other means. I will suffer and I will die. It doesn't matter that I am a devout, perfect Christian. Right. Even Jesus was crucified. Even the apostles were killed or martyred or eventually just died themselves. So looking into the whole issue of how widespread suffering is and how non-specific it is to any person in their situation, it tells me that should God exist and should he have the power to prevent suffering, for whatever reason, it's not on his priority list. And there can be some things to say about what that would say about God. So when you think about those sorts of things, what do you what comes to your mind about, okay, what might this say about God that he doesn't seem to prioritize human suffering? Yeah. Or maybe you have a different outlook on it.
My perspective right now is that if God had all of those attributes and that wasn't on the top of his priority list and he really was all loving, then I don't really see how those things can like work together, because and a lot of people at this point will bring up, well, God's not going to like infringe on your free will. Like he values free will over getting rid of that suffering, right? But then this is where I would bring up, okay, but in the Bible, there's countless stories of God, quote unquote, I guess, going against free will. Like, let's look at the story of Jonah. Jonah's own free will said, I'm not going to Nineveh, right? Jonah chose that. Yep. God said, nah, you're going to Nineveh.
It might be that the story of Jonah is parabolic, but then we can even look at the story. Well, I mean, there's the story of Pharaoh, but a lot of people talk about how it was his initial choice to be hardened, and then God just gave him over to his depravity. What is his face? Balaam? His name.
Balaam.
Balaam.
And the donkey, yeah.
There's that one.
Yeah, there's also Paul, Road to Damascus. Like Jesus just shows up and is like, hey, you should stop what you're doing. You know, like there's lots of instances where God like steps in and will do something that you could argue would kind of infringe on somebody's just unadulterated free will, right? He's stepping in and doing something that will kind of help them make a decision that is a better decision or whatever it is. And so like my argument against that is like, well, free will isn't, for one, I don't think free will is necessarily what we often make it out to be. And then at the same time, I don't think not infringing on our free will is apparently one of God's high priorities either. How about we circle back to the idea of the omnis real quick? of
Okay.
and kind of try to wrap up that and talk about the possibility that God could not have all of those qualities,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and what that would look like.
Okay.
So
So go on. You do it.
okay, yeah. So going back to our conversation on the different omnis, there is the possibility that I guess God could be omnipotent and omniscient and like all of those omnis, omnibenevolent. But one thing that somebody made a point of one time is that is never a claim that is explicitly said. Like none of those are actual claims explicitly said. Those are things that now later in kind of our Western mindset we've brought in and tried to
Hmm.
give language to, because we think that there is enough evidence, I guess, in the Bible to say that he does have those things. But I would suggest that maybe if that God exists or if other gods exist, that isn't the case. That
Hmm.
maybe this God is not all powerful, or maybe this God is not all knowing, or
Yeah.
like all these different things.
Yeah.
Even saying that God is personal, maybe God isn't personal. And we could get into that if we want
Yeah.
to, but
Especially like the possibility that God is not all powerful. I feel like if we allot that, it really helps solve a lot of issues. And I
mm,
commonly will bring that up like whenever an atheist talks about how there's just no way that there can be a good God that exists in context with our horrible reality. And
mhm,
I just say, well, I mean, maybe God isn't omnipotent. Is that what it is? Yeah.
omnipotent.
Omnipotent. Man, I don't know why I struggled to pronounce that. But
He's
anyways, maybe
very
God isn't,
potent. No, he's all
yeah,
potent.
maybe God isn't omnipotent and he's just doing the best that he can. Like this
Yeah.
reality did not go as he would have had it go. This reality is not ideal. And so he's just trying to do the best he can to redeem it.
Mhm.
And I feel like that makes so much sense with a lot of places in our lives where it's like, okay, well, why didn't God just do this? It also makes sense why God would even need the angels at all, like to work with him and for him. Like there's
Or
that
why,
whole story. Hmm?
yeah, or why God would have to use like very natural events to get things done. Like you said in the last episode, why couldn't he just snap his fingers and then boom, it's done?
Yeah, just have the things happen. Why is it that an angel had to travel from one place to another to deliver a message, but got held up because of demonic activity or something?
Yeah.
Why couldn't God
Also,
just go, hey,
Also, how in the world was Jacob, that weird story of him wrestling with God? Jacob won in that wrestling match.
mm-hmm.
Like, how did he do that? It's
Yeah,
just a
it's just,
strange story, but I think it says something if we're talking about that. Um, I guess even just like what the Bible would say about God.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Like there's just so many things in there where is it really necessary for us to complicate the waters by adding, oh, yeah, God is omnipotent and omniscient and all of those good old omnis. Uh, and there's also like the question of like, is God truly fully benevolent?
Hmm.
Because I think that what I'm tempted to do sometimes is when I consider the possibility that God might be evil, is that I consider, oh, he's just going to be evil, like just horrible, wants everyone to suffer and die kind of evil.
Yeah.
And I then use that as an excuse to dismiss the idea that God might be evil because, well, I mean, not everybody is suffering and dying. Only some people are
Yeah.
suffering and dying,
Also, that's
which
not a
is
very
terrible.
yeah, and it's not a fun thought either to think like, oh man, God could just be straight up evil. Like nobody wants to believe that.
Hmm.
Um, which, I think a lot of these things could get into the idea of confirmation bias of like, I want this to be the case. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, let me find ways to justify that in my holy text.
Yeah.
Like I want God to be this way. So, oh, okay, this verse says this. So that must be true. I'll ignore the
Yeah.
other ones and hold on to that.
Yeah. And I think we also need to consider the possibility, like some of the worst atrocities in the world had good intentions at heart. And so it's
Oh yeah.
possible that God might have good intentions, but still go about doing or trying to realize those intentions in ways that are evil.
Hmm.
And it's hard to say, like, do we even have is it even our place to say whether or not God's methods are right and wrong? And in a way, I mean, scripturally, an argument can be made that maybe it is our place to say, because there are at least two occasions that come to mind where God is like, I'm gonna destroy them, and one of his followers is like, maybe you shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
then he goes,
I guess not. Yeah, he like changes his mind. Yeah, and then
mhm,
there's also the possibility that, and I'm actually going to kind of get this from like the story of Jacob wrestling with God. That God, the divine, is something that is in us, which you could even just say is like the Holy Spirit, which I would probably argue, while was a new understanding, was always the case. Like everybody, I guess we all have this spirit in us that is God. And when Jacob wrestles with God, he's wrestling with his spirit inside of himself. And that is the spirit we all, to some extent, are connected to. This, I don't know, like I'm still like developing a lot of this. I need to dive into some more resources to help kind of put words to it.
mhm.
It's something that like the Liturgist podcast will talk about, or I think Father Richard Rohr definitely talks about it in kind of in this way of like the universal Christ. Like all of us can live into our own divinity that is God. Like when we experience love and beauty through our human interactions, like that is God. Like that is God's presence. Like us living into what it means to fully be human. And
Hmm.
and if
So
that's
it's
the
like,
case,
as humans, we are an extension of God.
not sure how to answer that.
Okay.
Maybe that's not, well, yeah, I'm not sure, but kind of the idea with that is then God would not be this external being, but this being that connects all of us, even connects us
Hmm.
to the earth and to nature and the universe, um, and is not all powerful. And even talking about the different omnis isn't maybe the right way even to think about God. Maybe that's not even a good way
Hmm.
to describe God. Maybe we're asking the wrong questions, about what this divine being is, and even what it means for us to live into our own humanity. Um, Maybe that's just not the right way to describe it. And
Yeah.
that's kind of where I am, like, just personally throwing that out there, kind of like where I'm leaning and learning and feel
Hmm.
like connects more with me.
Yeah. And there's definitely that temptation to try and shove God into an understandable box.
Oh yeah.
And we even talked last week about how if God exists external to our reality, it's hard for us to say that he should be anything, like
Yeah.
any way that any attribute or characteristic can apply,
Hmm.
because it's a world that does not function in the same way ours does. So, yeah, and I think I get what you're getting at, in that it's not that God is this or is that, it's that God is all things at all times.
Yeah, it's like what,
Interwoven.
almost like what, and I want to say, what Paul says, but I know Paul gets this from a Greek philosopher, is like, in God we live and move and have our being. Like that is like yeah, I don't know. And so like God is this reality, and is intertwined with who we are and what the world is. And in that sense, that connects us to each other and to the world. And
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that we're still learning, everybody.
we're still learning. Yeah. So I think it'd be important for us to get into this topic, which we can talk about it as long as we want,
Hmm.
but this is just our experience. Is I wanted to ask you, how have you felt like you have experienced, if you've had a connection with like a divine being, like what has that experience been like? And what do you think, at least your experience says about what you think this God could be?
So
I guess like
my
do you have like
experience,
moments where you felt like you experienced something and then maybe that informs how you think
yeah,
about God?
yeah, it's been really interesting. Like I've had to wrestle with my experiences and the conclusions I draw from them, in that there were definitely things and experiences that I had in life that, because I was so immersed in the Christian culture at the time, I immediately attributed them to God
Mm-hmm.
and used them as a further reassurance that God existed and that God was true and that what I believed was true. And I feel like part of that made me exaggerate the impact, or rather the magnitude of those situations. I'd say probably one of the biggest situations where I feel like I witnessed the work of a deity was when my family was doing mission trips. And so there was a lot of like interesting coincidentally being on the same page going on between my parents and us kids, that eventually led us to decide to sell everything we owned. My dad went to college to get an associate's in script writing and cinematography. And I think he's getting his master's, or he already got his master's recently. I think it was in the same thing. I can't remember. But he went and got that degree and quit his job. We immediately became bankrupt or had to file for bankruptcy. And a friend loaned us an RV. And then for the next 3 months, without any income, we traveled the country trying to raise funds to do missions trips for this ministry. And that was some of the most interesting experiences, like combination of experiences I had ever had, in that my family didn't have an income. We would show up somewhere randomly we've never been before, and people would just give us money. And it wasn't that we would go talk at churches, sure, and then we'd get like support from there. But this was just us showing up somewhere, having not talked to anyone yet, and someone walking up and giving us $2,000 or giving us money. And I question, I almost feel bad that this happened, but somebody used their food stamps to pay and get us a Thanksgiving dinner on Thanksgiving while we were in the midst of that whole process. And we were this family of 5. So life is not cheap for a family of 5.
Yeah.
Especially as I understand now that I have a family of 3, soon to be 4.
Yeah.
So for 90 days, it felt like every single day I was experiencing some miraculous provision of food, of resources, of gas for the RV, and just one thing after another. So that was probably the most spiritually dense experience I've ever had. But it even then wasn't so blatant and obvious as to give me reason to be like, oh yes, God exists 100%, because there's a natural explanation for pretty much everything that happened there. And the nature of the supernatural is that it is less likely than any natural possibility.
Yeah.
Because that's why it's the super nature.
Uh-huh.
So it's one of those situations where it's like, how many coincidences can there be in a row before it seems intentional? And so it felt very intentional. And I even felt that it was weird because those things stopped happening the moment my family kind of started to settle down and not get as involved in missions. Which may mean that, I don't know, maybe someone was following us around, making sure that we didn't fall to pieces. But I feel like my wife and I witnessed a bunch of interesting situations like that throughout our dating situation. Like there'd be times where I'd just be doing my own thing. We went to 2 different colleges. I'd be doing my own thing, and then something would come up some topic, some passage or verse or whatever that felt super relevant. And then apparently it happened for my wife too. And then we'd come together and we'd talk about this thing happened. And she was like, whoa, this thing
Yeah.
also happened for me. And it's totally separate, unrelated situations. Like sometimes churches will follow the same like schedule in terms of teachings, but that wasn't this situation. This was totally different things, and it just so happened to come together, and it did something for us and our relationship. And it's like, wow, that was coincidental.
Yeah. Wow.
And seemed kind of intentional. And then there was just this other time, my wife and I, for a while, we were considering getting involved in missions work, and that never really came to fruition, which was interesting because it felt like while we were pursuing it, all the doors, all the barriers that was between us and getting to that place were just getting knocked open. And we even went on a vision trip at one point, just kind of like get our bearings and see what the lay of the land looked like, what sort of things we would be doing. And we used the money that we got from like gifts from our wedding to pay for that. And it was literally only a few dollars, the exact amount that we needed to do that trip.
Wow.
And so that all felt very coincidental, and God breathed. And then we got pregnant, and we we're like, well, I guess we're settling down. So it didn't end up actually following through with that. Who knows what'll happen in the future with it, if anything. But yeah, those were a few of the incidences throughout my life that I felt like I had an encounter, apart from those moments where I felt like spiritually moved, like in worship or through a sermon or anything like that. When it comes to things that I witnessed that really felt like this is an act of God, there were those situations that I just mentioned, but nothing super blatant and obvious. But there's always been something there. It's like, I feel like there is some relationship with something there. Maybe I am not certain, not going to lean upon that too heavily, but I can find hope in that.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So what about you? What has your experience been with a possible God or deity?
Yeah. So I have definitely been processing this a lot as I have kind of re-examined my life and re-examined those experiences. And so I'll point to a couple. So when I was growing up, music was something that always very much connected to me. And so I eventually was like, I'm going to become a worship leader, because that was just something that like it always just spoke to me a lot and connected to me. And so, I can definitely point to different moments during like times of worship where I just feel like I've had some connection to something divine and these like very deep spiritual experiences with myself. And as I look back on those things, what I see is I'm going to kind of get there a roundabout way. Then like, most people are going to be like, oh, that was God moving in your life. And like, I can maybe describe it that way, but in a roundabout way. So how I would see that is like in those moments, I was unlocking parts of myself that had been closed off. I was finding out more about who I was and who I wanted to be and who I just am, like what is my identity. And as I did that, I would have these deep spiritual experiences that then you could say like, that is God. Like that experience of me, like unlocking that potential in myself, or even like finding the beauty in myself and finding my own identity, like that experience is God. And then also just the experience of singing with crowds of thousands of people or hundreds of people, that there's something beautiful in that. And then the beauty of doing that, like that is God, like not necessarily in the sense of like God is just like moving in my life. And, that's just like how a Christian would describe it. I would describe it as like this connection to myself, this connection to humanity. Like in the midst of that, there's something spiritual, there's something divine to that. And so that's kind of how I've processed those experiences. And then I also have had times where like my wife was in college, I was the only one working. I was mowing lawns for a living, and it was getting winter time. So like my hours were super all over the place, and it was like money was hardly coming in. But I was able to do that and like find these random side jobs. And then I became a substitute teacher for a bit, which was weird, but it provided for us for a bit. And through all of that and through all of the stress, like finding peace in that very stressful time and very like, I don't know where where the money is coming from next. Like I don't know. Like we've got to buy groceries and stuff. And finding peace in that, I would say like, that was me once again, like unlocking something in myself to like let go and like just, especially if things like you can't control, like, and I did the best that I could, but also just like finding peace in that, like that experience was something spiritual. And, at the time I was like, I'm putting my trust in God. And now I kind of look back and see, I was kind of just letting go of the stress and the anxiety that wasn't necessary. Like I didn't need to hold on to that stress and anxiety. And in that experience, that is what I would describe as God, I guess.
Gotcha.
Which now a lot of people probably hearing that, because the first time I hear that, like heard people describe their spiritual experiences that way, I'm like, that's heresy. Excuse you, that was God. Describing it in this weird human way is just silly. But I'm still exploring what spirituality is. I'm still exploring what that is, and that's the way that I like to describe those experiences.
Yeah, and I can actually really relate to that because back during the early parts of my wife and I's marriage, like we were in a very similar situation. She was working at like part-time at a donut shop, and I was working at Hobby Lobby and just had started. And that doesn't bring in a lot of money on both sides. And so we were constantly in that sort of situations like, all right, we're going to be able to pay for like rent. We were in an apartment at the time, and all of the expenses that life is going to be throwing at us. There was a lot of situations. There was a really weird year where every tire on my wife's car just died and popped at some point. And I don't blame her because the roads in the city that we were living in were just terrible. They were just awful. And she had a drive to work eventually. She got a different job at a music store, and that paid better, but the road getting there wasn't the best.
Yeah.
So we probably lost some of the money, that extra money we're making because of the tire thing. But yeah, I get what you mean. Like there's that beginning part of like, okay, where is it going to come from next? Do we need to worry about that? Because I mean, up to this point, every time we've had a need that like we weren't sure how we were going to overcome it, it seemed like God came through, which is hard to kind of say in a way, because although it was true for us, like what about all those situations where it's not true for others?
Yeah, exactly.
And that can be really tough to swallow. Granted, there is the possibility that is allotted by the fact that we live in a world where sometimes somebody who's experienced suffering of a certain variety will have nothing to do with or will not listen to a word that another person says unless that person has suffered in the same way and can understand their position. So, I mean, there is the possibility that suffering in this world exists, and quality of life varies so much from one Christian to the next, because in a way, quality of life would be a mission field, in that you're not going to be able to speak into someone's life unless you've been through that same or are in the midst of that same pain. So, I mean, that's something that I always thought was like a possible explanation for like, why do Christians suffer? But it's still a tough, like, why would that person need to go through that sort of suffering to begin with?
Yeah, exactly.
In order for us to get to there, it's just, there's a lot of questions that arise for each possible answer that you present raises just more questions.
It definitely does. And yeah, I definitely have, that's something I used to say is like, maybe I'm suffering for this so that I can speak to somebody later who has suffered through this. But now I look back at myself and I'm like, well, it also could just be me adding meaning to those experiences, because that's what we do as humans is we go through something and we try to find meaning in it and purpose behind it. And that's where I think, it can be helpful sometimes to, whether you're a Christian or in some other religion, where like that religion can add some meaning to that experience, but sometimes that does add some baggage as well. That would raise more questions of, well, what about this situation? Because that doesn't fit in this box that I have here.
Yeah. But something that just dawned on me just now, and that is, there's a bit of beauty in that. Like, you don't have to assign it's interesting how the assumption that there is a God orchestrating all of the things that are happening, and a God that is allowing you to suffer for a reason. It's interesting how the for a reason parts can kind of stem from the assumption that there's a God behind it. But it really doesn't have to. To stop in the midst of a bad situation and reflect upon how it might help you to be able to help others later, that is something that you can experience whether you believe in a God or not. Exactly. That's something that you can lean upon to get through a tough situation, whether you believe in a God or not. And that's something that I don't think I really recognized up until just now. And that, like, going forward in this new place where I am so uncertain, if I do happen to experience some extreme moment of suffering, I can still look at that and be like, if I get through this, then I can be a better person towards somebody else going through this someday in the future. And so this experience doesn't just have to be suffering. It can be valuable to me and valuable to someone else.
Definitely. Yeah, that's good. That's something that I had to come to terms with as well through all of my searching. I do have a question for you, Christian, and I think this is an important question, one that came to mind recently that I'd never thought of, is have you ever had negative spiritual experiences that you have typically attributed to like Satan or demons? Like, there's lots of people who are like, Satan, the soundboard goes wrong and they're like, the devil is working in our church right now. He's coming after our soundboard. But could that, before I get there, have you had those like negative experiences and in like the realm of spirituality?
I think when I was younger, I don't know if there's ever been a time when I really kind of took those sorts of things seriously, in that like something would go wrong in the church and I'd be like, oh, Satan's at work or something. I'd be like, I don't know if I want to make that assumption. Maybe something just happened. We're probably going to talk about it anyway. So, I mean, why would they bother wasting their time? I always recognized the possibility, but I don't think I ever wanted to jump to that conclusion, because when you jump to that conclusion, I think that you miss the opportunity to problem solve. So if it's not satanic, if it's not a spiritual warfare issue, then by just saying it is a spiritual warfare issue and leaving it at that, then you might be missing something important.
Hey, that's very true.
If somebody's lashing out, you can't just say, oh, that's the devil in you. Maybe they have trauma that they need to work through. Maybe they need help. Maybe they're lashing out because they don't know how to express their anguish and express their need to be helped. So you need to have mercy and grace towards them in their moment of anger or lashing out, and figure out how can you best help them, or point them to somebody who's more equipped to help them.
That's really good. Yeah.
I never really made that attribution. But I always recognized it. And I mean, I'd always hear people talk about it. But what about you? Like, where And that's not to say that I look down upon anybody who has, because I totally get that people come from different worldviews and perspectives and maybe even have different experiences that would warrant them to look at these things differently. So that was just from my walk of life, the way I looked at those things.
Mm-hmm.
So from your walk of life, Micah, how did you experience the negative potential spiritual battling or whatever?
Yeah, I was in places where we talked about spiritual warfare a lot. And so if the soundboard did go wrong, we literally would say that's the devil, which, is really convenient that the devil decided to come to our little church um, on that particular Sunday and subsequent Sundays sometimes. I guess he really liked our church. And anyway, but I think the ones that I probably took a lot more seriously were, they always talk about like, the lies of the devil, the lies you believe. And so a lot of my own like insecurities and things that like brought me shame and stuff, like I would attribute to the devil or to demons or something, so that kind of like spiritual warfare. And to some extent, that can maybe help you feel a little better about things, because then you think like, oh, well, that's not just me, that's some external force coming against me. And instead of acknowledging those thoughts as my own, or that own shame as like the shame that I am carrying, I'm like, oh, it's this external thing that, I need to like fight against this external thing instead of deal with the things that are going on inside of me. Kind of like you were saying, like there are lots of other ways that you could describe that are very, just human, like part of our human experience that have actual solutions. And once you say it's spiritual warfare, then what do? You pray about it and you just keep praying if it doesn't solve it, right? Instead of actually like maybe going to a counselor or seeking some kind of help. But what I was thinking is we typically, and lots of, religions do this, where there's like this good and then there's this evil spiritual force. What if those are the same God? What if it's all just one God who's just kind of this weird binary, like,
isn't that dualism?
Not
Is
sure.
that the term for that?
I don't know.
Like that's one of those things. That's one of those concepts where, like, I've heard of it before. I've heard that possibility, and I also have heard people talk about how, like, in the Old Testament, that was the perception of God that a lot of like God's chosen people had of him. And that like somehow makes sense of like some instances where it's like, and God did this thing which caused this person to do this thing. But then another place where it's referencing, and then the devil did this thing which did this thing. And it's the same situation. It's like, okay, but yeah, honestly, I have not spent a ton of time meditating upon that possibility, but it sounds like you might have.
I haven't. Honestly, that question kind of came up as we were talking, but these were my initial thoughts as I like brought that into my mind. Is it probably feels better to us to believe that there is something that is all good, not something that's both good and evil, and that we are on the side of the thing that is good, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be on the side of something that's good and evil, and you definitely don't want to be on the side of evil. And
I actually I think I have a good way of thinking about this, looking at it. So don't you just love how in standard evangelical Christian circles, anytime something goes wrong and it is happening to us, it's, oh, that's the devil for you, man, it's the devil. But anytime something goes wrong and it's like for somebody else, like an atheist podcast or something, it's like, well, there's God telling you that what you're doing is wrong and that you should probably consider doing something else.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so at what point to what extent do things have to go wrong in your church for you to start to wonder, maybe we're doing something wrong? And I wonder if that might play into that dualism. Because if bad things can happen in both situations to communicate something, then maybe it's just God doing it on both ends. Like,
Whoa.
Maybe it's not God doing it at all. Maybe it's all just coincidental. And I think that that's how any situation like this should be assumed from any position. But
Right.
to humor the possibility, maybe it's God that's making the atheist podcast have technical issues. Maybe it's God that's making your church have technical issues. Maybe he's not a big fan of either of those things.
And maybe God's just, really petty and actually cares about your podcast, or cares about, instead of dealing with like world hunger and stuff, he's going to mess up your podcast. Like, and
Oh yeah, right. Oh my
it's
gosh.
so interesting, like the way that we assign eternal value to things and say like, well, that's just God. Like, but you're totally right. And in my mind, I'm like, wow, of course we would do that. Is like something like we always assume, which is a natural assumption, that we're on the right side of God, and something coming against us is not God, because we think we're on God's side. But then if it happens to someone else, then that must be God trying to get you over to
trying
my
to knock
side.
on your door.
When really, like, I think, like, if there is a God, he's got better things to deal with than like messing up your sound system, or like, which sound systems are finicky no matter what religion you are. Like, so
Technology, man.
yeah, that's just kind of how things go.
Maybe I just need to blame Satan for all of the bugs I have to fix in a day. I do software development.
Oh yeah.
Man.
Oh man.
The other week, this is just a quick aside, but man, I spent 4 days trying to solve this issue, only to find out that my changes weren't actually being applied to my browser, because I had to do a hard refresh where I like emptied the cache or whatever. I tried 12 different solutions and it didn't feel like any of them was working, but maybe all of them did work and I just didn't think to do the hard refresh. Anyway, that was annoying. That was a waste of 4 days. I felt really good by the time that was done. But anyways, I'm just going to blame Satan for that.
Yep. Totally Satan.
So there was a second thing that you were wanting to talk about after the dualism part, unless there's more you want to talk about the dualism bit. But
yeah, I think maybe just to wrap it up really quick, I think it's important to note just how we as humans, and it's something we need to pay attention to, is whenever we're assigning something that like, oh, this is God, this is Satan, like just to remember, like kind of everyone is doing that. And are you doing that because you actually think there's something spiritual going on? Or are you just doing that because you're a human being and you want to blame something? And you never want to blame God for the bad things. And you also want to only give God credit for the good things. So I don't know. I think we just need to like, be self-reflective on that, because there's a lot of good things that happen that are just, maybe humans are just good and nice people, and there's bad things that happen that are just part of life.
Yeah. And I think that in addition to that, like, ask the question, if the standard response to bad things happening in your life is that that's the devil, and if the standard response that you have to bad things happening in other people's lives who maybe aren't Christians is, oh, that's God trying to get you on the right path and show you that what you're doing is wrong, then there's literally no act of God that's going to do anything for you. Like, if God is trying to tell you something by something bad happening in your life, then you're not going to get it, because you're just going to blame it on Satan, and then vice versa. So yeah, what would be the purpose of God even doing any of that stuff if it's not going to accomplish anything? Right. So and maybe it is just technical issues.
And maybe
or whatever.
If it was God, maybe he could be a little more clear on what he's doing.
Right.
Because yeah, like somebody, just throwing this in there, somebody made a video one time of like, listen, if God exists and you say he's all knowing, right? He's all powerful. He knows what will convince me that he exists. Like, he is well aware because he's all knowing, and he has chosen not to convince me. So is it my fault that I don't believe? And I was like, oh, wow, that's a really good point, because you're right. He does know. He knows exactly what will convince you. And, people are going to say, oh, but free will. And it's like, okay, but he convinces other
Mhm.
people. So like, is that free
Yeah,
will?
I mean,
Like, I
he
don't know.
convinced Paul, so why isn't that a widespread thing that happens?
Yeah. Anyway, just throwing that in there. So now let's kind of move on to what I think, for me, this is one of the most important questions that I ask when it comes to most topics. But why does it even matter what you believe about the nature of God? Like, why does it even matter?
Mm. Yeah, like there are so many different possibilities. And that if it did matter, I think we'd all be screwed. Because
Hmm.
if it mattered if the extent of correctness mattered for your salvation, I guess.
For like an afterlife salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
For like an afterlife salvation, my understanding of God, like I don't think I ever talked to two people who had the exact same understanding of God.
Mm-hmm.
Like if they were within the same denomination of Christianity, maybe they shared similarities in some of the more things that they thought were essential. But talk to anyone long enough and you'll find some deviation.
Oh yeah.
And so everybody has this different conception of God. And if it's important that we all have it completely right or completely figured out, or at least partially correct, like you can't draw a hard line and know when a person is saved. So why are we so concerned?
Yeah. What percentage of knowledge do you need before you're saved, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this is where, especially in the Christian circles, which once again, listeners, those are the circles we've been a part of, so that's what we can best speak to. But
Mm-hmm.
they would say, like, oh, just believe in Jesus. Okay,
Yeah.
but then you say, oh, but I believe that like it's not a sin to be gay, and they're like, well, then you're not a Christian. Oh, but I thought it was just about Jesus. I guess it's
Mm-hmm.
more than that. Oh, okay, well, I don't believe the hell exists. Oh, well, then you're not a Christian. But I thought it was just about Jesus. And like they start
Mm-hmm.
adding and adding and adding the knowledge that you're supposed to believe.
Yep.
And so then it very quickly becomes more than just believe this one thing. It becomes so much more.
And then there's the understanding of Jesus. Like
Yep.
there's probably plenty of Nazis out there who believed they were good Christians and
Oh
that
yeah,
Jesus totally approved of everything that they were doing.
exactly.
They had a perception of Jesus that's probably completely different than most other people's. A lot of people like to say, like you said, that God just revealed himself in Jesus. But because there's so many different understandings of Jesus, it didn't really do much to like make sure everybody was on the same page. We're all on very different pages. There's 40,000 different denominations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's just Christian denominations. And like, what about other ways that people have had spiritual experiences? Like, how do you,
Other
like, what do you even do
religions.
with that? Because they have a completely different understanding. They have a completely different holy text, like all these things. And so like, yeah, I agree that as far as like a afterlife salvation knowledge and like perfect understanding of what this divine being is cannot be the deciding factor, the criteria.
From what I have been able to gather, if the system and situation that is set up that we find ourselves in is such that there is a God and there is a salvation system with an afterlife at the other end of it, and there's like criteria or whatever that you need to meet to be saved, I think that the only situation that gives humanity any kind of hope is if God is if that one if the criteria for salvation is humility, and that a person is just willing to accept that they're probably wrong about a lot of things when they meet God and receive correction.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's not that, and if you have to have some special kind of knowledge or something, and there's thousands of people that are seeking and all coming to different conclusions, there's just not a lot of hope. I don't feel like there's a lot of hope in that.
I agree. And I would say that maybe the best hope is that there is no criteria, that we're all just like given divine grace, and that
Mm-hmm.
grace isn't something we earn, which, now I'm starting to sound Christian. It's not something you earn or deserve. It's not about, or maybe even asking if you deserve it is the wrong question, because you just have been given it,
Mm.
which maybe that's the case. But
Yeah.
so why So for like, yeah, for like an afterlife thing, like I agree. It maybe doesn't matter. But for our life now, how does that affect how we're going to live and treat other people,
Mm.
depending on
You
what we
know,
believe about the nature of God?
there was a bit of a backfire that happened to me in my life for the like in the Christian culture. Christianity really likes to make you feel ashamed of yourself and of your desires and your nature as a human being. And
Mhm.
it did a number on me to the point where I was like, if like God's not going to force me into heaven if I don't want to be there. I feel like that's going to be one of those criteria. It's like, if you don't, do you want to be in heaven? Yes or no? And I think most people assume, of course I'd want to be in heaven. Why wouldn't I want to be in heaven? And yet, as from the Christian theology, every day we choose sin. And sin is not of heaven, sin is of hell. So
Mhm.
every day we choose hell. And I am constantly making decisions where I am choosing things of hell.
Mhm.
And so I I sat down, I thought for one day, I was like, if I'm standing at the gates of heaven, if my life is any indication, I'm not going to walk through them. I'm going to choose hell because that's all I've ever chosen.
Whoa.
So I might as well just accept the fact that hell is what is waiting for me at the end of this. And I don't have the guts to kill myself. So
Mm.
I'm just going to try and be the best person I can be and squeeze any kind of good that I can out of this life,
Wow.
out of myself. And so there became, for me, it was a little strange, like the whole question of why do any good, why live a
Mm.
good life. For me, it was just, I might be a horrible, terrible person, but God is good and amazing and perfect. And so I'm just going to do whatever good I can with
Yeah.
what I've been given and not let it go to waste. I don't care if there's a reward at the end of it, because I don't think there is for me. I
Wow.
don't think I would accept it if there was.
Dang, man, that's tough. I'm sorry that, that was your experience. That's really
I mean, I'm not there
that's a dark
anymore,
place. Yeah,
but
no. But I mean, that's a dark place to be. Um, yeah, let me just kind of give some of my thoughts
yeah.
on why I think it matters. For one, if you believe that certain people for one, if you believe that everybody is inherently evil and bad, that is going to inform how you treat other people, because you're already going to think like, if something bad happens to them, well, that's just what they deserve. And this is something that was true in my life. Like, I thought everybody was evil, bad. We all deserved hell. That's what I was taught. And so if something
Hmm.
bad happened to me, I would just think, well, I'm just getting what I deserve. Right. Like,
Hmm.
I don't deserve anything good. So if something bad happens, that's just what's coming to me. And anything good, I was always so thankful for, because like, oh, I don't deserve this. And that's such a toxic thing to believe. Like, it's such a
Hmm.
damaging thing to believe for myself, that made me carry a lot of shame. And then at the same time, externally, if I believe that, like, for example, anybody in the LGBTQ plus community is like, just, God hates them, how am I going to treat them?
Hmm.
How am I going to view them? Well, very poorly, right? Like, I'm not going to treat them with love and respect. Like, I can't, because I think that they're all doomed. And anyone from other religions, I can't possibly listen to them or respect them, because they don't have the knowledge that I have. They don't have the Holy Spirit in them. And so, like, that's going to greatly affect how you treat other people. And
Hmm.
that's what concerns me the most. And that's what I see in religions and in Christianity, and especially certain versions of Christianity that are really toxic, is that they have this view of God that then translates into how they treat people, and how they treat people is really bad. Like, just objectively, just not nice, like evil,
Hmm.
like however you want to describe it. And that stems from their view of God and who they think this God is. And so that's why I think it's really important for us to be asking these questions, and consider other possibilities, because if your view of God leads you to treat other people poorly, there's a problem there. There's a real problem
Hmm.
that I think you need to consider.
Hmm. especially if it's leading you to, as some people say in some comments, fortunately I haven't had any of these comments yet, but some people talk about how, man, I can't wait until I'm standing on a cloud looking down from heaven, just watching your face when you realize that you screwed up and that you're going to go down and suffer for an eternity. It's like, you need to do some reconsidering of what it means to love your enemy, because that is not love. That is not good.
No. No, it's not. Yeah, if you take pleasure in other people's suffering, if you even have that desire to watch people suffer, it's not good. Like, I think we all should hopefully have a good enough sense inside of us to know there's something very deeply wrong with that. But that can be the outcome. If you believe in a certain version of God, then that is exactly what you might feel sometimes. And so we need to check ourselves. And we also especially need to check ourselves. I saw a video on this one time. If God hates all the same people you do, you need to see if you're actually creating that God in your mind, because that seems a little
maybe
sketch.
that God is in your own image and not you in that God's image.
Right. Exactly. So all important things to consider when considering the possibility of God is really like, is this going to lead me to love people better? It's going to lead me into what the good life is and find fullness, or is this actually damaging me? Is this damaging other people? And that should be a point where you should start thinking a little deeper about what you believe.
Yeah. Well, I think this conversation went pretty well. I definitely know that we went into some cool conclusions and stuff.
I think so too. And we can always come back to some things next week as we talk about the afterlife and how that affects our view of our life now, and also what God could be.
Yep. Yeah, it's going to be the Fire and Brimstone podcast episode. Judgment. And
also the pearly
sin
gates
and hell. And the pearly gates.
All of the above.
Oh boy. All right. Well, cool.
So where can people find us? How can they connect with us?
Okay. So you can find Micah and I. You can find Micah. He's at Pondering Together on TikTok. And you can find me at Truth Voyager on TikTok. And then we also have a Patreon. You don't have to do that. We're mostly just having these conversations, But if you do want to financially support us and like getting our equipment and stuff together, then you can check us out there. I think it's just it's either just Morning Ponderings or Morning Ponderings Pod. So available on all of your favorite listening apps.
Awesome. Yeah, so feel free to reach out with us. Let us know your questions, anything that we may be misrepresented or misconstrued, then, let's have a conversation. We want this to be open-ended and we want to ponder with all of you. So
give us your insights and help us to learn.
Yeah. So thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.
Everybody have a great day.
Our goal is to explore the mysteries of life in... Okay, yeah. I'm trying to remember how exactly it's worded. We aim to... Man, okay, I need to wake up.
It's one of those mornings, right?
Yeah. But anyway, listeners, this podcast's goal is to explore life's greatest mysteries and all the possibilities. And so oh my gosh. Okay. Our goal is to explore. Our goal is to explore life's greatest mysteries and... Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. I got it this time.